Welcome to the European History Lecture for Thursday, the 7th of January, 2020. We start out. Hyperbolic language is something that orators use to try to draw people in. So in some ways, we sophisticates are inured to hyperbolic language, saying that this or that or the other is the most dramatic thing ever, or the bestest ever. Well, when I'm talking about the change between a pre-industrial and an industrial society, I ain't just a woofing. I am not engaged in a hyperbolic declamation that's just designed to emotionally draw you in. I am speaking as firmly grounded a truth as I can to you. The difference, again, the only things that are comparable in terms of our lifestyle changes are when we developed the ability to somewhat control fire, when we developed the ability to farm, and when we developed the ability to speak and understand one another with verbal language, and I suppose writing. That's how big this change is, because what is being created in England in the late 17 and early 1800s, and in New England in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and then throughout the British Isles and throughout the United States and Germany, later in France later, is literally a society like no other. Up until now, everyone has known what human society looks like. Most people farm or produce food in some other way. There is a small middle class of people who are skilled, and there is a smaller upper class of people that rule, and somewhere around the middle class, upper class boundary are the warriors that protect and enforce. So there is this sense of similitude between Ming Dynasty China and the Aztecs and the Babylonians and Napoleonic France. Even though these societies are remarkably different from one another. Some have gunpowder, some have the printing press, some are very, very big, some are not. Some are the results of thousands of years of progress. Others are not. Others are fairly self-generated. But they all are agrarian societies. They all have from 70 to 95% of their people growing food, and then the other 5 to 30% do everything else. Now, agrarian societies, existing from Sumer, the world's first civilization, up through 18th and 19th century Britain, revolved basically around three things: field, throne, and altar. These three things dominate life. Most people work in the fields. How do they learn their jobs? Well, sons go out while they're little boys. And in addition to being used as footballs by the older men, hey, catch my son. Whee! Got him! Oh, lost him in the sun. But in general terms, no, the little boys go out and they learn to work with daddy. The little girls stay in and learn to work with mommy. That's how people learn. Now, in addition to daddy and mommy, there's the extended family that they live with. There's grandpa, grandma, uncles, aunts, cousins, nieces, nephews, children, grandchildren. And there's the rest of the village. I was watching a video this morning about Kyoto, Japan, and why many Japanese don't like people from Kyoto. Now, Kyoto was the imperial capital for over 1,000 years. It hasn't been the imperial capital since 1600, since Tokugawa Ieyasu. Actually, a little bit before that. But people from Kyoto use this sort of indirect, hyper-polite language. Get your nose. And so they'll say things like this. Oh, your children, they're so energetic. You know what they're really saying? Shut your loud brats up. They are way too loud. But it's so much nicer to use the indirect language of saying, oh, your children, they're so energetic. I was going somewhere. And it wasn't just to talk about Japan. It was to talk about the use of indirect language. Field thrown altar, you learned from your mommy and your daddy. It takes a village to raise your kid. So, you know how in America some parents get tetchy when a stranger tries telling their kid what to do, like stop coming over here and kicking sand onto our towel? Don't talk to my kid. Well, that isn't the way it used to be. Used to be, if your kid was kicking sand onto somebody else's towel, not to the extent that people had beach towels, but no, the other adult would say, "Hey, kid, stop that." And if you didn't stop that, then the stranger would use your kid as a torpedo. The kid would learn. We, in our kindness, in our current civilization, we are so freaking hyper kind that we don't teach people things. The one lesson that kids still learn, because they have to, is how to spot when the important adults in their life are having a bad day. You learn those signs really young because you can mess with mommy or daddy or whoever when they're having an okay day, and they will have the self-control to deal with you. But if they're not having a good day and you beep, 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 you're going to get a reaction that you won't like. That's normal. That is natural. Well, used to be kids would learn how to behave in public by listening to their parents and following their example, but also by being disciplined by the people around them. Because everyone knew how everyone should behave. Now, among my Irish ancestors, this takes an interesting twist because Ireland was an occupied country. And like many conquered peoples, the Irish have to learn not to be noticed. Because if you are noticed, you're the tall nail that needs hammering. So, Irish families then, and to an extent, up through the 20th century, some still do, are very strict with their kids. Because if the parents don't teach the kids how to behave in a conquered country, the British will. Or if you're in another conquered country, whoever the occupying power will. Everyone learned by watching and by doing. And again, people your age would have been full adults. No questions. You become an adult sometime between puberty and your age, and most of you, if you were peasants, and even if you were lords, or ladies, would be married, maybe having your own children, certainly working for a living, and having all of the freedom to the extent any adults had any in those days, depending upon where you were, and the responsibilities of adulthood. We have perpetuated childhood to somewhere between 18 and 22. That's where it was when I was your age. Everyone was expected to become self-supporting between 18 and 22. You either go out to the world work right after high school, or you go to the military. You go to college for 4 years, and then you do that. Today, I'm sure, know people who are supposedly adult who are living like teenagers into their early and mid-20s. That's not natural. That's not normal. That's a new development, and we'll see what happens with that. It's not necessarily because people want to. It's because finances are difficult, and getting started is difficult in today's economy. Field. You learn by seeing and by doing. Throne. In all of these societies, with the exception of the American Republic and the French Republic, everyone understands that the God appoints leaders over us. And therefore, we, out of respect for God or the gods, owe duties, religious duties as well as civic duties, of obedience and loyalty to both the Godhead and to his representatives on earth, the priests and the king. No king is a-religious. All kings in the European tradition, and frankly in Asian traditions, and Latin American traditions, and even African traditions, are sanctified and coronated in religious ritual, because those kings are representatives of God or the gods on earth. The kingly office is a sacred office, And whenever, I don't hope for this soon, whenever Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II dies, you will see either Prince Charles, I hope not, coronated, or William, who is the grandson of Queen Elizabeth and the son of Prince Charles, coronated as king. And the coronation will be deeply Anglican Christian, to the point where holy oil is a crucial part of it. And they're coronated and crowned by the the Archbishop of Canterbury. There is no separation of church and state. There is a conformity of church and state, which should be familiar to you since we've talked about the Middle Ages and the Reformation and all of that. So field, throne, and altar work together to create a life of tradition that people are born into. And their job, once they're born into it, is not to change things, but to be a good person in the role God placed you. If God made you the son of turnip farmers, be the goodest. And I don't mean by that most efficient farmer. I mean the goodest as in being a good person. Be the goodest turnip farmer you can be. If your parents are craftsmen and you're a guy, then be the goodest. Be the goodest. Yes, I do mean goodest in this case. Be the goodest woodworker or blacksmith that you can be. Learn your craft, yes. Be good at it, yes. But mainly your job is to be a good person. Not to rise up. That is a more modern value. God put you somewhere, do that well. In that sense, the West has some aspects of Confucian ideas. Certainly not from Confucius, at least before contact, but the idea of being placed somewhere by God, like a person places a little statuette on a shelf somewhere, and then the statue's job is to look good in that position. Well, that image of life as a structure that you are added to, but that you are not expected to radically change, either your position or the things around you. That tradition is somewhat timeless and immutable. This is all part of field, throne, and altar. And even the townsmen, to the extent they live their lives within a broader culture, with even townsmen with their you are what you do, not you are who your father was. Even townsmen accepted that the broader pace of society is dictated by field, throne, and altar, and by sort of these timeless rhythms. And the people in the countryside certainly felt this way. Paris may have been all agog about new ideas, but much of France was not. And the strong fight against these reforms by the Vendée is a good example of that. More than anything else, if you were transported back to these eras, to pre-industrial times, wherever you go in the world, the quiet would shock you. We're used to announcements. Not to mention music, to the extent that's music, movies, video games, all this stuff. You are used to audiovisual stimuli. You are used to flashing lights and pinging and beeping. You are used to the sound of motors and of industry. In fact, much music, including some of the heavy metal music I occasionally like, and some of the rap music you may occasionally like, almost is an imitation of factory machinery, going about their business, doing their jobs, with their deep, booming rhythms. Quiet, though, is the characteristic of pre-industrial times. The loudest thing, aside from a battlefield, which, thank God, wasn't an everyday occurrence, was the church bell. In every community, the church bell called people together for Sunday worship, for Easter, for holy days, called people together to make announcements. They signaled victory. They could also signal calamity. Come together, there's a fire, we need help. So there you are working in your shop. Maybe one of the loudest shops you could work in is a blacksmith shop. You get the sound of the forge. And then bing, 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 bing. You know, the blacksmith is pounding on the steel, shaping it. But you can still hear the church bells. If a rider is coming by, like Paul Revere, he will shout warnings and move on. And he wouldn't expect people to be in their house surrounded by closed windows, air conditioning and or heating, and the sounds of whatever electronic devices they're walking around with. You certainly wouldn't expect people to muzzle their own ears with various kinds of sound producing devices that go right up against the eardrum. The quiet of pre-industrial times is big. Now, a large city is still going to have the hubbub of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or later, even millions of people. And when you get that many people together, they're going to make a background roar. I can attest to this. As a little kid, I knew that when I visited my grandparents in the Bronx, we had lived in suburban Connecticut, that there'd be this sort of rich background of sound, and also that it doesn't get fully dark at night because the street lights. I mean, the city that never sleeps, New York City, you always have lights everywhere. The light pollution there is much greater than even in here in downtown Coeur d'Alene. So there would be background sounds if you were living in Rome during the Empire, if you're living in Paris. But you don't have the mechanistic sounds, you don't have the roar of jet planes overhead, you don't have any of that. It is a quiet world, defined by field, throne, and altar, a world similar to that which goes back to ancient Sumer. Now, for those of you at home, you should watch the videos that I am posting in addition to this, and then come back and, assuming there is part 2 of this lecture today, watch part 2 of this lecture today. But I can't show you online, or the archons of YouTube will spank me for being naughty. And God knows I don't want to be spanked by YouTube.